good afternoon, or good evening, depend on where and when you are in the world today. Welcome to today's virtual event, How to Make Network Management Easier in 2024-25, brought to you by Network Computing and broadcast by Informa. I'm Steve Hill, and I'm pleased to be your moderator today. We just have a few announcements before we begin. Throughout the event, the slides on your screen will advance automatically. You may download a copy of the presentation slides from your green resources folder, which you'll see at the bottom of your console and on the left side of your slide windows. If you have questions for our presenters at any time, submit them in the Q&A widget on your session screen. Additionally, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please type your issue into the Q&A text area. To refresh your console, hit F5 on the Windows machine or Command R on a Mac. At this time, we recommend that you disable the pop-up blockers in your browser. And finally, please feel free to keep the conversation going and connect with other attendees in the group chats. This is accessible in the Zones area of the virtual event, as well as on the group chat on this webinar console. If you wish, you can have this webinar and the virtual event open at the same time, but in separate browser windows. We'd also like to establish our position on the use of generative AI. So I've been asked to mention that generative AI tools may have been used in the creation of the following slides. We will endeavor to disclose where and how these tools have been used in text and images. Please see our About Us page for complete editorial policy on generative AI. I myself am not an AI, but I'm starting to wonder about some of you out there. And now on our first keynote session of the day, Network as a Service is Network as a Service right for you? Presented by Carrie Getz, the CTO of Strategicom. Carrie is principal and CTO of Strategicom, as well as a fractional CEO to several companies. She has nearly 40 years of global experience in designing, running, and automating data centers, IT departments, and intelligent buildings. She is an international keynote speaker who has been published in more than 250 publications and is a 3-time Amazon best-selling author of the Jumpstart Your Career in Data Center series. It's nice to see you again, Carrie, and you may proceed whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Steve. Happy to be back. I appreciate you. So today we're going to talk a little bit about network as a service and try to figure out, is it right for you? This technology has definitely grown and become much better over the years. And I think as we look at a lot of these as a service models, what we really have to do in the evaluation is figure out which one of those services are applicable to us and which ones we even care about. So today in this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about NaaS. Just to let you know about me, you had a short little bio there, but I've been in this industry for actually over 40 years in some shape, form, or fashion. And that's really where this experience is coming from. I started out in networking when nobody even knew what networking was. We were still on SneakerNet back in the days. And for those of you that are young enough that don't know what that was, that's literally us taking data around on floppy drives via our little sneakers from one machine to another. So I started when there was no networking, and now, I've been in this industry throughout this period of time. So let's jump in and talk a little bit about some of those differences. So if we start first and talk about what is NaaS. NaaS is networking as a service. That's the ability to be able to reach out in the cloud, pick up a port, pick up cybersecurity, pick up a virtual private network if you need to, pick out those network resources and be able to consume those on the fly, be able to provision those on the fly, which is a little bit different than traditional networking. In traditional networking, we decide we're going to have a network. We go out and create all of our switches, our routers for our wide area network. We handle our local area networks. We have to manage those ports. One of the nice things about as a service is we can do this for the ports as we need them instead of having to buy 24 port switch just to use one port. So we do have some different abilities here, at least from a wide area perspective, looking at some cost reductions. And we'll talk about more of those. And as we talk about the benefits of network as a service, we'll really get into the whys and whats in those same conversations. And then we'll talk about why you want to consider it. Why would this be good maybe to add to your portfolio, to your networking portfolio, maybe to replace your networking gear and equipment in your networking portfolio and go with something completely different. And then we'll talk a little bit about how it works, which again will help us sort of answer that question for the who, what, and why. But if we start with the why, we really look at, you got to kind of contrast what the difference is between a traditional fixed line network and something that's going to be more, user based. And so when we think about traditional networks, if I was setting up a network for, pick up a company, I'm going to have to organize all of the wide area network lines. I'm going to have to organize my switches, my routers, all of my ports based on the number of people that I have. If that tears up and shuts down, I'm going to have to consider it there. If I have people that are working in remote locations at hotels or bars or coffee shops, obviously I need to be able to address security in those situations. And we really start looking at all of the points of ingress and egress in our networks and figuring out the best way to provide the best services with the lowest latency. Certainly we want to make sure that they stay up and working and all that kind of stuff. And we do that letting somebody else administer that versus us administering that, or some combination thereof, maybe a little bit of a hybrid where you have some local abilities to be able to do some things. And then we also can add on top of that things like self-organizing networks, that kind of help around certain processing tasks and use a little AI to help that. There's definitely some cost savings, because if you think about it from a cloud perspective, that is one benefit of the cloud. We can do things like concurrent licensing as opposed to individual actual licensing. And because not everybody's on the network at the same time. If you have a fairly large remote faction of your workforce, they're going to be up and down. They're going to be on the network in meetings, not on the network, all of that. So we really want to kind of think about not just the number of employees, but how many are concurrently on at any location, and then sort of figuring out what those logins look like and see where those savings might shine their little head. So, we also have an equipment savings, because if we're using somebody else's equipment, clearly we're not buying our own. So that helps us not only with the initial equipment costs, it helps with the inventory for replacement parts, the ongoing maintenance that you have to pay on that equipment for all your software updates and everything. That's something that now becomes somebody else's problem, at least for the portion that is network as a service. And then we think about compliance. Compliance is something that most companies have compliance officers. That's all they do, is deal with these issues of compliance. But depending on the type of company and what you do, those compliance requirements might be significantly stricter. And not all companies that deal with compliance have huge workforces to be able to deal with all of those issues. In some cases, it's easier to be able to say, hey, look, if you need all of my points of ingress and egress, here's a report from my provider, as opposed to me running around and dragging all those reports and doing inventories on all of those machines. So in some cases, there's going to be some more advanced reporting and things that are available in an as-a-service platform than you would have as an individual company without buying additional software and adding that additional overhead load. And then also just making sure that you've got somebody kind of covering your back and double checking those compliance things and compliance related tasks. Now, we know that there's things like, for instance, pharmaceuticals with CFR 11, they're going to have networks that will never touch a public network. And so in those cases, you might have a hybrid environment. You might have that firewalled, very quarantined environment that runs itself, and then you might have a different environment for, say, your sales force and people that are out there running around. But all of it still is going to fall under a compliance network. And so this is a way to really be able to add to your resources to help with some of those compliance related tasks. And the other thing is a skill shortage workaround. Now, keep in mind, some companies have entire departments of networking individuals. Some companies have one person that can spell computer and now is over their entire IT stack and everything that is IT. So how does that one person keep up to date on, here's all the networking stuff you need to know, here's the storage stuff you need to know, the server stuff you need to know, here's how you deal with remote access, here's audio, video. It starts becoming very, very difficult. And if we can scale that back and say, okay, what are the tasks that we can offload for the easiest benefit? In some cases, it's definitely the network. And that really is going to depend on the skills that you have internally and what workarounds you need or what augmentation you need. Sometimes it might be that you have people that are plenty qualified. They're just not time qualified because they don't have, there's only so many hours in a week and people do need to sleep, contrary to what a lot of employers believe. And then think about having that external expertise too, right? The world of cybersecurity and the world of networks is continuously evolving and changing. One really great example, when we went from IP version 4 to IP version 6, that boggled a lot of people with very basic network training, and they didn't understand how to reconfigure things to take advantage of the newer stacks. So when we think about doing network as a service, we're really leveraging some of that expertise that sits at those other companies that we can now bring into the fold in our own companies and take advantage of that. And there should be some knowledge transfer. There shouldn't be things that they're doing that you don't understand what they're doing. So make sure that that happens. But just really, if you view them as that expertise extension, sometimes that can sway the things a little bit. And then think about patches and updates. This is all time that you're offloading out of your calendar because they're going to be doing that for you. And if somebody else manages that piece, it really helps with a lot of things. It helps pinpoint those problematic employees that go out of their way to circumvent IT and make sure that everybody stays patched and up to date, because it becomes part of the login process. And then the other thing is vacation. What happens if you are one of those small departments and you really want to, your spouse is on you to take a vacation and unplug? It would be nice to be able to turn some of this stuff over to companies that can do that for you and know that your network is still going to be monitored, maintained, and taken care of while you go get some much needed R&R on the beach or mountains or wherever you choose to go. And then there's also the idea of rapid startup and provisioning. As we bring new employees on, we bring new locations online. If there's mergers and acquisitions, trying to assimilate everybody into the same network can be quite the task. So if we're doing network as a service, we have the benefit of, again, having those other resources, but also having those tried and true methods for how do we swing people over, how do we pick people up and add them to our network and make sure that they conform to all of our security policies. And sometimes that rapid provisioning can be a really big help, especially when you're dealing with acquisitions. If you think of bank mergers as a good example, you get not only the bank, but you get every one of those branches. How do you bring them into the fold? Sometimes network as a service is a very quick way to do that. So if we think about, some of the advantages, we've kind of talked a little bit about what network as a service is. How do we figure out what we need to implement and what's the best way to put that in our portfolio and in our active compute environments? And I think the first thing that is really helpful to do is to come up with that statement of need. Company XXX, we need a network in such and such location that'll have this much bandwidth, this much latency. Here's our SLAs, whatever that needs to be. Now, the tricky part is when you're evaluating a new technology or you're going for something new like network as a service, you don't always know what you need to ask. And so that's really where you can rely on vendors. And we'll talk a little bit more about that to figure out what you don't know. The other thing is you're really going to have to know what you're replacing. If you're going to look at network as a service, you need to know all the points of ingress and egress for your network. How do people get in? How do people get out? Which locations are coming in securely? How many people are coming in from non-secure locations or open access points? What are those points and what are we replacing? And those, in many cases, these studies are eye openers. I can't tell you how many of these I've done over my career, and people are so surprised that they have these extra lines out there. They're surprised they have connectivity to office locations that don't exist, maybe some old carrier lines. There was a whole industry at one time just going through people's phone records to figure out lines that were not in use anymore that people were still paying for. This same thing happens. It is a management when you're talking about wide area networks and local area networks and devices on networks, figuring out where these people are and making sure that when somebody leaves, all of their equipment comes back and those lines get shut down. If we do this as a service, then we have those dashboards and it's a little easier to do that. And honestly, then we have other people that can help and tell us which ones are getting literally kind of nothing. The other thing you want to do is you want to involve all of your departments. You want to get a super user from each department and a department head from each department. And the reason for that is that sometimes you're going to find applications that exist that those departments use that maybe the information technology department knows nothing about. And it truly happens. I can't tell you the number of times that happens. But what you'll also find in this discovery is there might be applications that they have that have maybe a fixed IP address, or there's some that absolutely cannot go down, or maybe now is a good time to add, as we're going through all of these points of ingress and egress, and we're looking at our disaster recovery and business continuity plans. And maybe now this is also the time that we assign risk to those applications and figure out, which ones do we need to put on an always up network? Which ones, if they go down, it's going to be inconvenient, but it's not going to kill us. And which ones these are really nice to have, but maybe this technology ends up somewhere else. So normally when you see these network projects take place, the nice thing about that is that we now are assimilating everything that we're really using on our networks. We're figuring out what all our software is, where all these ingress and egress points are, who our users are. And now this becomes a big part of your disaster recovery plan, or at least a gut check of your disaster recovery plan. Or if you don't have one, maybe it becomes the start of your disaster recovery plan, right? So we want to make sure that we have all those people, because the last thing you want to do is spin up a new network and realize that some critical service has been cut off. I personally know of one instance where this happened, and the service that was cut off was the lines that transmitted payroll to the payroll company, so everybody got paid. Kind of an oversight, a very, very loud vocal oversight, right? So we want to make sure those don't happen. The other thing we want to do is make sure that we involve cybersecurity. So for most of these providers, they do have some set of cybersecurity that runs on top of these. Some of these guys, it's included in their package. Some will run that on top of your own cybersecurity, so you have that double layer if that's where you want to go. But again, you have to make sure you don't slow the network down. But figuring out what your cybersecurity response is and how that's going to work and who's going to be responsible, should there be an event, and what services they provide to you. Because if there's a place that you need to pick up and take over, those are things you need to know. And that needs to be coordinated with all of your trainers and your technical support, because these are the people that are going to train your end users on how to use this network, how to make sure that everybody is signed in the correct way, and that we don't have smart users circumventing everything that we're trying to set up here with cybersecurity and access. And then we want to make sure that we know all the platforms we're working on. We want to make sure whether it's cloud, multi-cloud, hybrid, only local, AI stacks are definitely going to be a huge game changer in all of these scenarios, because AI just operates very differently from an IO perspective. And AI actually can be used to help some of these networks. When we start looking at some of those self-organizing networks and some of the AI that can run on top of those, there's some additional capabilities, which is another advantage of doing this as a service, because then you can kind of pick and choose the pieces of that service that you really need. And then we want to make sure, of course, that all of this fits in those same compliance plans. Anything that's going to cost you money, make sure that it is a line item on your project, and you know that you're not going to get fined for those things. And figure out what tools they have to make you more successful and make that process easier, because compliance is not easy. And then figuring out what those current and future workloads are going to be. If I'm considering network as a service, maybe I have a remote location that has 25 users and 14 are concurrent, and then I know that I'm going to have an acquisition and I'm bringing on 3 other places, and I might be retiring a few other places. The advantage of being able to do some of this as a service is to say, hey, look, these are going to be shorter term contracts for these guys, or I'm going to pay for concurrent users or on the platform across the board. So as people move and leave, you're not dealing with their equipment, you're dealing with their login, which is a little bit different and certainly easier, but it helps you for planning, because some service providers have groups of users, from 0 to 24, for 24 to 48. If you have 25, you're paying for an extra 24 users that you're not seeing yet. You might not see for the next 3 or 4 years. So figuring out how that billing works and how your current and future performance is going to fit in that billing is definitely going to be important. And then if we start comparing solutions from provider A to provider B to provider C, a lot of them run on the same architecture. Some of them run on exactly the same equipment. So what really sets these people apart? One of my favorite things to do is an RFI, and this is different than an RFP or an RFQ. And I understand that all vendors don't like to answer an RFI, and to that I say shame on you, because I think it's really awful that you're so arrogant that you don't have to do anything to earn new customers. That's my personal opinion. But RFIs don't have to be that crazy, but it's a way for people to figure out what your technology does. You can throw a white paper in front of them, but that doesn't answer questions. An RFI is a document where you can put every vendor you're looking at on a level playing field, figure out what the capabilities are of their equipment and their technology and how that's going to apply for you. And then after that, you can do a vendor bake-off, and that can be testing a few solutions side by side. If you have a test dev environment, you have the resources to do that. It might be that you bring them in and have them run a few examples, transferring large files, see what it's like to set a user up, take a user off, do the things that are important, bake that off and figure out, see, compare and contrast, because what you'll find out in those first two steps right there is there's probably a lot of extras and bells and whistles and goodies and nice to haves that you probably didn't even know exist because you're looking for that basic stuff. And as you start working with a vendor, maybe vendor A has a really, really great piece of their product that's coming down the pipeline that you really want, but you like the stuff from vendor B better. You might find out in this that vendor B is adding that functionality in the next release, and maybe you can wait for that next release and you can get all of it. But without knowing what they cover and how it works and what those look like, it's almost impossible to make a decision. And then you want to make sure that you can verify their service level agreements, look at what their uptime is, see what that past performance is. And one of my favorite tricks to do for this is not to ask the company for references, because if they're smart, they're going to give you references that say good things about them. The best thing to do is go look at old press releases and call those people a year later and say, hey, how's your support been? How did it go? I see you put this solution in a year ago. Or go to some of your local events and ask around there and figure out, who else is using that technology. Sit down and talk to them person to person. What is the worst part? What is the best part? How can I be their best customer? Those kind of things will help you out. And then, and you'll also get that customer satisfaction out of that. Now, some vendors go a little farther. If you already have a bunch of wide area equipment and local area equipment, they can do buybacks for that to get you into different solutions. If they require a certain manufacturer at the endpoint, for instance, maybe they'll buy back your other equipment. Maybe they'll do an upgrade. There's all kinds of things. Maybe they can lease. They'll buy your equipment and then lease you equipment, so you're in an OpEx mode instead of a CapEx mode. But figure out what they can do to help you get in their environment. Ask those questions. Ask what incentives you have, because they're not going to offer them up unless you tell them, unless they think it's really close and you have a really good salesperson. In some cases, they just don't mention those. And those are things that you need to ask for. And then again, for the cybersecurity, if you want to stack your cybersecurity, that's one thing. Make sure that it'll operate with yours without slowing things down and making it awful, because if it's awful for your end users, they're just going to circumvent it anyway, even though they're not supposed to, but we all know that happens. And then isolation and fault response. What can they do for you? If there's a dedicated denial list service, can they knock that out? If there's a ransomware attack, do they have some method of knocking that communication out and protecting your assets? Is there other things that you can add onto this platform, whether it comes native with the platform to start with, or you can add it? And do they have APIs? Do you have individual programs that you need something else? Maybe I need to know when people log into the network, I want it to tick their time card box so I know what time they're in and what time they leave. What are those other integrations that you can figure out and figure in, and then see if they're going to work in that environment and make sure that there's nothing that's going to stop that from happening. And then for cloud integration, this is so huge. I think we're really getting to the point in this industry where companies are evaluating technology at an individual kind of application level as opposed to across the board, and cloud is a great piece of that, right? That's why we have all these multi-cloud environments and hybrid cloud environments, because people really need to control that cloud spend. I think AI is going to be one of those things that kind of breaks the cloud just because it's so IO intensive. So what you might have is your data center or most of your applications in the cloud, but your AI might be local in your data center on site. so that you have that control and you can control who's using it and the bandwidth that it takes and that kind of thing. So those are things that understanding your bandwidth, understanding, your jitter, what your packet loss is, how those packets are getting from point A to point B. All of those are reports that you can probably get out of your NaaS system, and you should have those reports before you put that NaaS system in too, so we know what we're engineering around or trying to fix. And then we want to look at how many internal hours is it going to take for me to spin this thing up? How much help do we have? In some cases, it's a very automated process. It's super easy. You just point and click and say, I need this to connect to this, and I need this to connect to this, and then you're good. But you need training to make sure that you're doing that correctly. You're doing it the right way. You're setting up the right bandwidth managers, all that kind of stuff to make sure that that's successful. So figure out what those hours are. What is that knowledge transfer going to take? And how much of this do they offload? In some cases, you might use this as a service, but keep your own management in-house. So what do you need to do that? And is there a method to do that? And then figure out what those setup demands are. There's a lot of applications that you can send out. The tricky part is when you have remote people, and I'll give you a great example. I worked for a news agency years ago, and we were trying to get cybersecurity and personal responsibility things set up for the IT department. It was a corporate-wide directive, and so we had to go cut off people that didn't comply and didn't sign their paperwork. It definitely upset some of the news people. Oh, well. But the point is that as we start figuring out this setup, do we have to bring in laptops to do that? Is it something we can send out remotely? What is that? We need to make sure that we have HR involved. We need to make sure that we have corporate governance involved to make sure that as we set this up so that we can be more secure, people are going to operate in that secure environment and that it is supported from the top down. If it's not, it's going to be a very, very difficult implementation. And then we want to think about inventory. What do you need for equipment? Are they going to supply that on a lease base? Do I have to sell my equipment? Is there other equipment that I can get from them to make that easier? Are they going to maintain it? Are they doing all the patches, all of that? And then, that gets you to your day two costs and what that's going to be. But if we think about what NaaS can replace, at least from an as a service, rent, lease kind of, it can really take care of a lot of things. Our routers, our switches, any of our access equipment, all of that can be leased from NaaS providers. Sometimes it's incorporated into just a little small appliance. Sometimes it's bigger. Think about your security appliances that can also become part of this. Same thing with your VPN, firewalls, cybersecurity. AI is another bird. Are we going to run AI over the top of this? Is that going to help us with our networks? Is it going to help us outside of our networks? What is that going to look like? And, we might even have very separate networks, like I said, for AI. That might be in its own firewalled, quarantined environment for various reasons. So figuring out how that's going to operate within this network environment is going to be important too. And in some cases, that's an advantage of going to NaaS, because now you can use AI that they're pouring over their network to your advantage, and it's their license, it's not yours. So, those kind of things are certainly helpful as well. And then for intrusion detection and prevention, you want to know what that cycle is. And part of that RFI, part of those documents should be, hey, if this goes wrong, go pick the last 4 or 5 cybersecurity incidents that you can read about or know about. Say, how would you deal with this? What would those steps be? What would the escalation procedures be? Would we be shut off? Could you cut us off before, this ransomware or whatever propagates the network? How do we know what those responses are going to be, and then figure out what that looks like? And all of this should be part of that pre-implementation for sure. And then encryption. Do we encrypt everything across the board? Is it encrypted at rest? Is it encrypted only in transit? How does that work? Because those are things, especially nowadays, right? Because AI is just going to make attacking things faster, unfortunately. So how are we going to protect from that? What are we doing to protect ourselves? And then we want to look at some of the enhancements that we can add to these systems. So if you're in a small to medium business, you have maybe one remote site, your needs are going to be exceptionally different than if you're a larger company and you have a remote sales force, for instance, and maybe some remote SMEs that go around and do repairs that still need access to stuff back at corporate. Maybe they need access to very private things in very public environments because they're trying to get these patches to load on somebody else's network, all of those kind of things. So we can add some network function virtualization. We can add some self-organizing networks in there if we need to, and depending on the complexity, that might be something that you're, that you're great for. Load balancing, figuring out voice packets versus data packets. How do we handle all of that network segmentation to make sure that, voice and video are disparate from regular network traffic, so we don't cause jitter and we don't cause problems with latency and those kind of things. Because obviously, when you get into streaming type services, then those network problems become audible and visual, and you can see them. You got pixelations and dropped words. So those things become very important there. And then we want to make sure that we can manage our bandwidth. And a lot of companies kind of step back from this a little bit at one point, but if we think about it now as we're adding more and more collaboration, we want to make sure that we can manage what goes on from one segment of the network to the other segment of the network. You might be doing, even think about end of month closing, end of year, end of quarter. Those are periods of time when the network might be significantly busier, at least internally to the data center, than it is outside. So maybe at those points, when they see that the load is picking up and it's east-west traffic, maybe we want to move some of that traffic and set it on its own network for that period of time until things settle down. Maybe we want to throttle back some bandwidth. All of those things are things that you can do, but you have to have the tools, right, to be able to do that. And then some of them have enhanced quarantining, like, as I said, denial of service or a ransomware attack. If they see it on one segment of the network, they can segment that off from the rest of the network before it propagates through. Certainly the appliances we have that are trying to do it. But what happens if it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you're sound asleep? We want to make sure that somebody is looking at that. And when you're doing it as a service, normally they have big teams of people that are 24/7 that are looking out for your stuff anyway, because they're looking out for their network because you're on their network. And then troubleshooting. What resources do they have? If I can't get to a database file, for instance, is it an IP address issue? What can they do to help me get there and overcome that hurdle and figure out what I need to do to the next step? What happens if I can't see a site? Where's the determination? Is it with the carrier? Is it with the network? Where does that go? So all of those things are definitely high on the hit parade of things you want to look. But, if we look at the appeal of it, really, scalability is a big thing. A lot of these as a service packages, certainly as a service applications, they're great because we can work on that concurrent licensing and concurrent login. So good example, you're running 3 shifts a day and you have 12 people on each shift. Do you need 36 licenses or do you need 12 that are, because we're only going concurrent licensing? Big difference in cost between 12 and 36. So being able to reuse some of those assets, rapidly provision those, change that provisioning, plus the ability to have that centralized management without having to dial in to different locations and all. It's normally in one console, one cloud-based console, so you can see it all. And then as you configure it, you should be able to go back to that company and say, hey, can you just gut check this for me and make sure I didn't miss anything? And they'll be able to do that. And then operation automation, sometimes things happen at, we know that we're going to do updates at midnight every Saturday night. So at 2 o'clock in the morning every Sunday morning, we need all of our equipment to talk to each other and make sure everybody got an update, and we need an exception report for anything that didn't. Those are some of those kind of things that you can automate through these systems. And you can probably automate them if you own your own systems too. There's just going to be a different cost to this. So when you start weighing out which individual neat things to have versus having those things yourself, I think you'll start realizing that when you start looking at some of these as a service, they're a lot more mature and developed, and in many cases have a lot more functionality than something you would try to build on site yourself, because you would have to go through that. Even with open source, you still have to figure out what it does and how it works. And if you're a little strapped for time, which a lot of us are these days, then sometimes this just takes that off your plate. But you still have to be able to understand kind of what that functionality is. And Then also when we think about rapid deployment and new sites and figuring out what we're going to do with the next site that comes online and the next site that comes online, having those plans ahead. In a lot of cases, these providers can go out and they'll understand what's already at that site, or they already have a relationship with the internet providers and they can ask and figure that out, and they can be that extra resource. Pay as you go is certainly a big thing, being able to spin people up and down. If you think about the number of times that a company is over or under the number 24 or 48, for switch ports, think of all the equipment that gets bought because somebody's won more than that. And, now you got to buy a 24 port switch. If you could say, hey, we're going to do this in a round robin fashion, we're going to have, concurrent network connections. And so we realize some of these connections don't even happen. Some of these connections can really only happen at night. So maybe we take those off because those are just for backups and those kind of things. Now the equation kind of changes a little bit because you're not paying for absolute connections. You're paying for concurrent connections and connections as you go. And then, of course, rerouting of resources. If you are with a provider, in most cases, they have a much larger exchange than you're going to be able to have on your own. And if there are issues, it's certainly easy for them to circumvent it. And a lot of times they'll do it in a very automated fashion because they have AI on their systems that are helping you out with that anyway. So things to watch. Vendor lock-in is a huge one. I've been in this industry for over 40 years, and I can't remember a time when vendors did not want you to use their stuff to the exclusion of all others, right? Even though they're supposed to play well in the sandbox and we have standards, there are times where vendors lock you in and you can use nobody else. And where this comes into play, if you are in multiple countries, say that you've picked a NaaS solution provider that is amazing in the US, and now all of a sudden we have a new location in Sao Paulo, Brazil. If your provider's not in Brazil, that's going to be an issue. So now you have to work with a couple different providers. And if the new provider in Brazil is very good and you think, oh, maybe I'll use them in the United States, how locked in are you in your current vendor? Anytime that you get on an as a service provider platform, 100% of the time you need to ask, what does it take to get me off of your platform? Because there's times when business relationships go south. There's times, we've all hired people that we realize at the end of the day, maybe not the best decision, right? And so, you think about that from a vendor perspective, the same thing happens. Maybe it was a good fit at one time, but you scaled past whatever they can do for you. Their support wasn't as good as what you needed at some point. But what's it going to take to get off that system? And you should ask that from every cloud provider. Also figure out what you can and can't control. Some of these systems are going to be much tighter, which if you're a business that is strapped for resources and strapped for people, maybe you're not as worried about control. Maybe that's something you're happy to relinquish as long as they operate within your security parameters. But figure out what that is. Figure out how much control you have. What can you change? As you add and drop sites, what are the not only financial ramifications, but what are the time constraints for you in those considerations? And then figuring out that knowledge transfer. Anytime you're using their system, they should be able to pass that knowledge on to you so that you can do whatever they can do. There's some people have that mentality. If I know everything and you know nothing, then you have to depend on me. That's definitely not the relationship you want from your networking vendor at all. And then we want to make sure that it aligns with our business goals. So if if we know that we're going to scale quite quickly, we want to look at the number of users, look at what those slots are. If can I add a single user, or do I have to add a block of 25? Because that's going to be a very different cost, right? That's going to be very different for your business goals if you don't think you're going to be adding those kind of people. So you want to make sure that they align there as well. And then figuring out that past performance, do the due diligence, go online, figure out where they've had hiccups and how did they address it. I mean, there's no implementation, I think, that ever goes off without a hitch. There's going to be a hitch somewhere down the line. Even if you didn't realize there was a hitch and it was a hidden hitch, there's still a hitch. But how did they fix that? How did they work that out? And think about future enhancements. And again, this is really where that RFI and having that relationship with your vendor it's just so critical because you've got to know what those future enhancements are. It's especially if it's something that you might be locked into for a 3-year or a 5-year contract. What are they going to do for you in that 3 to 5 years? Are they going to provide something you're going to have to pay to get out of that contract? Those are things you want to know. It might be that you are on an acquisition role and you know that you're going to be adding a lot of, or even on a growth spurt, right, for retail. Maybe you're going to be adding 50 new stores to your environment in a short period of time. What are those enhancements are? And then what's going to make that to where when you add that, the new location is going to operate exactly with the old location. They're all going to do everything you want. And you've got that one level, or that one screen to be able to add users, remove users, figuring out what those permissions are to make those devices and make those things happen. All of that is going to be different. And then you also really want to look at whether it's a proprietary or open standards based. And there is a lot of open stuff out there. It's great. I honestly think, especially if you're a smaller team, some of the open source stuff can make a world of difference just in time. But you also have to be diligent and make sure that you're working within that standard, making sure that all of the, that you're policing that environment as well. Because if there's an issue in that open AI, they're not going to come say, hey, by the way, you used our stuff and we found something, in this code from 2 years ago. It's on you to go find that. So just understand, what that time constraint is going to be. And if they're doing that for you, that's even better. But you want to make sure that as these enhancements come out or new things come out, that there's a good formal way to communicate that so you can make sure that you can assimilate that into your environment. Other things to pay attention to, obviously your contract terms. Is it a long-term, short-term? If you think you're going to stick with this solution for a long time, in many cases, it's much less expensive to do a longer-term contract. They're just harder to get out of. So, kind of figure that out with your business goals. And then your time to act clauses. What happens if there is an event? How much time do they have? How does that fit in with SLAs? Figuring out, most cloud software has a best effort clause. So make sure that you really read those SLAs. If they're just going to say, we're going to make a best effort to make sure that the software is available like they do on the applications, that's not something you want for your network, right? So we want to know if there is an issue, if they see a problem on the network, what is their time to act? What is my potential impact for downtime? What are my SLAs in that scenario? Is there another way that I can get into the network? How does that work? And then you want to figure out your abstraction layers. How does that work with the equipment that you have? If it's equipment that you're going to be keeping on site, especially in some kind of a hybrid environment, you want to make sure that whatever they have is going to interface with whatever you have. And then certainly if it's a single provider or multi-provider, not everybody plays together well in the sandbox. So you might find some that play better with one cloud provider than others, or some that you have to do an extra little API or something to make it work, but figure out what those are. And then, see if you could do a layered approach. How much of this do you need? Maybe I only want to do my wide area network and I don't want to do my local area networks, or vice versa, right? Figure out kind of what that approach is. Do you have to go all in day one? Can we sort a little bit here and a little bit there? Figuring out what that interoperability is, and then ongoing migrations and integrations. What is, if I'm going to bring on a new piece of software and it is network based and as a service, what steps do I need to take to make sure that that's going to go into this environment? And how do I migrate new facilities, new sites onto this environment? So figure out all of those moving forward. And then they also might have some really cool microservices and containerization. And when you start figuring those out, maybe you've got some stuff that PLCs in manufacturing is a good thing. Maybe we want a separate little network for those. We want a little container for some of those services, but we need it to interface with other ones. Having that layout and having all of your applications, what they connect to, who they talk to, what their ingress and egress needs are all going to be super critical here. Other than that, I think we have time for some questions here.
Great. Honestly, thank you very much, Kerry. You always have remarkable insights into business IT. And that, my friend, was a master class on the very complex and evolving nature of network management. I was working on a bunch of possible questions myself, and everyone was answered as you went along. So I highly recommend, if this is important to you, go back when you get the message of the ability to replay. Go back and listen again, because everything you really should know about network as a service was there for you to look at. So, I guess, and the one thing that came up was exit strategy, and you did touch on that. Ultimately, marriages are supposed to be long term too, but we know how that works out. So how important is having an exit strategy for a client?
I think that 100% needs to be part of any evaluation, without a doubt. And it may be that you think you're never going to get off, and you don't want to ask that, but you don't know, because things happen in business, things change. Maybe they get acquired by somebody you can't stand. Maybe they get acquired and the service goes bonkers. All of those are things that you need to be fully aware of. So you need to know everything that you're going to put on that network. You need to know all of those assets, how you're going to get them on the network, what services they provide, and then how to get out of that service if you need to get out of it. And maybe you can tailor off. There's a lot of companies that went into the cloud that were absolutely and utterly astounded at egress fees when they started pulling their data back. And you want to make sure that you're not in that bucket of uh-ohs, right? So you should ask those, and that should be part of your contract negotiation too. If there's reasons that you can identify that you would get off that network, then you need to be able to put that in your contract with that customer and say, hey, if these things happen, if you don't meet my SLAs, if I can't get to my if I can't have it escalated, if I have more than X number of days down, these are things that are hard stops for me. I want out of this contract with no penalty. And those are things you can certainly negotiate up front with the right providers. Not all providers, there are the big boys who are going to say, nope, it's my way or bye.
Right.
But, there's other ones that are much more nimble. And I think we're really at an inflection point in technology, period, where we have AI that can shortcut some of the tasks that we do. We definitely have a lot more intelligence. We have much greater bandwidth everywhere than we used to have. So, even the location of your data center is not really as critical anymore, because we've handled a lot of latency problems with a whole lot of fiber in the ground. So, having that, these are my hard stops, and how to get out is definitely going to be important. And if you know that you're going to use it for a period of time, maybe you're building a new corporate office building and it's a 3-year construction cycle or a 2-year construction cycle, organize that exit strategy before you sign that, because whether you choose to exit in 2 years or not, at least you know what it's going to cost you to get out.
Right. And again, that may evolve along the way. So it's something that you need to keep constant consideration of. Businesses evolve. That's the problem that we have here when it comes to customers that are looking outside their environment for skill sets that they may not have. Ultimately, it really comes down to each individual company. Some companies have some really brilliant people working for them, and they may want a lot more control over the environment than, for example, the average, or even like you say, the one person networking shops. I have a question here.
Here's the hard part about that too, kind of to your point though, is if you don't have those resources in-house, would you rather hire somebody that you're not really sure about because you can't fully vet their skills because you don't have those skills yourself?
Right.
Or would you rather hire somebody that might know what they're doing, right? If we go to the doctor, we're not educated consumers because we don't have medical degrees. And the same thing happens in your networking stack.
And honestly, there's a great segue here from a question that was sent in by one of our viewers today. And he asked about working with an agnostic partner for NaaS who can provide them one point of contact for all of the global multi-cloud providers, CSPs, AWS, Azure, DCs, essentially taking the stress of security, resilience, and bandwidth, et cetera, under SLA. Those are hard to find, I would imagine, because what I've learned in researching NaaS is that there's a lot of variance in terms of what the offerings are, how much overlap, and then getting into the more complex issues that you were talking about in terms of equipment decision choices and everything else. Is it easy to find a one-stop contract for these things?
I think you find NaaS providers that have a variety of services. Some NaaS providers are also, by the way, cloud providers, right? Some can set you up a nice little private cloud on premise, handle your networking, take over all that load. I think it really depends on what you're trying to get out of your NaaS system and what you need, right? Because different companies have, again, different levels of expertise. We have different applications. Some people run cloud only. And if you only are in cloud environments, obviously that's going to be a little bit different equation than somebody that has a full test and development side in-house. They've got, full networking staff to evaluate gear and do all this kind of stuff. And some people are going to be a combination of both. It would be great to find those nice agnostic providers, and there are certainly some that are more agnostic than others. So, look at Open Compute, right? There's a lot of open AI stuff and that can help you out. But again, it's kind of that expertise in figuring out what you know, and I just cannot stress the importance of vendor interviews, having that vendor on site, having him show you what their stuff does, and even from a CEO perspective, if you sit in on those meetings and you look at your IT staff, and as they start talking about things, their eyes are glazed over, you've just identified an area where you need to train your IT staff, right? That might be an area that would definitely benefit your company and your IT staff. So thinking about those kind of things. I mean, it's hard to know what you don't know, but if you start bringing in people and asking those pointed questions, show me what does this do? What does this do? And then as you get to the next provider, you ask them if they have the same features and functionalities that you thought were cool from the other one. Allow yourself 2 rounds of interviews so that you can go back and have rebuttal questions. But it's really important, I think, especially for something like your network, because if you don't have your data, you got nothing. So if you can't get to your data, it's just like not having your data.
Exactly. And that's one point I always talk about in terms of contingency planning and strategy for BCDR. I mean, ultimately, these all tie together in such a way. Security and networking, they're 2 different disciplines, but ultimately they need to match up. So this is, like you said, we're at an interesting inflection point in the way that things are going to be moving forward. I think we're going to see a lot more blending in terms of these disciplines that you need to. Yeah, you need to think about the security. You need to think about bandwidth. You need to think about SLA. You need to think about all these things. Finding a person, especially in a smaller department, that can do all of that. If you can, that's awesome. But you may not be able to. And actually having a specialized vendor out there that really understands this stuff, I think, is a huge bonus.
For sure.
I hate to say it, but we've run out of time. Carrie, it's always a treat to talk to you, and thank you so much for your great insights.
Absolutely.
And now go ahead.
It's always a pleasure.
All right. And now we welcome our attendees to take a quick break and rejoin this program at 2:15 Eastern for our next keynote, Top Network Automation and AI Tools for 2025.